Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Levi Norman, and we're going to spend a little bit of time today talking about Kyndryl's fully managed distributed cloud and how it helps at the edge. We'll go into some details around business value, and then we'll talk about the technology itself. So here's our agenda. We'll do a couple of intros of who we are. We'll then shift into a distributed cloud overview. Then we'll talk about Kyndryl's distributed cloud offering specific with Microsoft Azure and Dell, a set of components together. And then I'll walk through a couple of industry use cases, and then I'll hand it over to my cohort, and we'll go through some technical details in his version of strategic value. And then if there's any Q&A, we'll work through that pretty quickly as well. I threw away a couple of the business value slides. I didn't realize this session was 30 minutes. I was ready to be really long-winded and tell bad jokes and all that stuff, but we're not going to do that. So again, I'm Levi Norman. I run the platform team under Kyndryl Private Cloud Services at Kyndryl. And my cohort over here is Matt McSpirit.
Yeah, hi folks, Matt McSpirit. I'm an engineering technologist at Dell and talking to organizations like yourselves around Azure Stack and all the cool stuff we can do in hybrid on Dell infrastructure.
So, and beyond this, let me set the stage for what we're talking about, right? And I like the Gartner definition of it. It's imperative that enterprises prioritize a distributed cloud-based solution as the default and future-proof edge solution by relying on partnerships and ecosystems as opposed to a single vendor approach, okay? Along with intros, and I'll just jump through this. Again, I'm with Kyndryl. Maybe a lot of you don't know who we are. We were spun off from IBM approximately a year ago. We're about 90,000 folks strong, about 20 billion in revenue, and we have deep engineering expertise, right, relative to the other service providers in the industry that are out there. So this will be in the leave behind, but I just want to quickly introduce who the company is. If you want to chat more about that, come visit me at the booth afterwards, and I'll go into detail about who we are. So why distributed cloud? I always love quants, right? So whether this is off by 10% or even more, I mean, we could agree that roughly 40 billion IoT devices at the edge is going to be a lot. Roughly 80 zettabytes of data, all of this by 2025, right? Much of that data will be created outside of a central data center. Approximately 3/4 of it will be set up from outside the data center. And then, what do you do with that data? You got to make value with it. So 50% of the field service management deployments will include, RMR, and you can see an example of that if you come over to our booth, and we'll show you what that looks like. Augmented reality for, maintenance and repair. So, let's get into what distributed cloud really is. There's challenges that lead to a managed distributed cloud, right? Manual management of federated IT environments, bringing all those things together. There's always limited resources. That's an age-old issue. 30 years in IT, and I've never not seen that be the case. An inability to support or deliver business value at a remote or edge environment. We really are on like Gen 3 of edge environments, so we have to upgrade and take care of those. Or workloads with strict data sovereignty. In the European Union, violating GDPR requirements might net you a 10% fine on your revenue, on your total revenue. Imagine if you're a billion-dollar company, what that means to you. That could be the end of your company. Delayed time to value through manual orchestration and resource deployment. You want a lot of this to be automated, and the software layers that go on top of these distributed cloud now really allow for that. And then there's always an ongoing, just like a resource deployment, there's a cost of taking care of your legacy environments, right? I love the definition that VMware puts out there for distributed cloud. Distributed cloud is an architecture where multiple clouds are used to meet compliance needs, performance requirements, or support edge computing while being centrally managed from the public cloud provider. The one thing that's not there is through a single pane of glass. You can manage it yourself through this single pane of glass, okay? So let's talk about how we got to a distributed cloud. Approximately 10 years ago, what we saw was hybrid cloud being the dominant nomenclature, and I was over at IBM when that was the case, when we were trying to establish ourselves as the hybrid cloud provider. This is where companies started to put their toe in the water and play with clouds, right? Issues with it. Well, you couldn't really scale it. It was hard to contain. You saw a creep of shadow IT, right? That's an age-old issue as well. The complexity wasn't very, very high, but it was a little bit complex, right? Fast forward a little bit into multi-cloud, about 5 years ago. Complexity goes up. Why? Because we've got plenty of clouds moving around. We've got the rise of developers inside of these companies. Developers on average have about $12,000 of discretionary spend, and they'll go do this with the tool set that they're comfortable. So here we go with shadow IT again, right? And so it's hard to manage around that. Complexity goes up. Fast forward a little more to where we are right now, distributed cloud. So we've got now cloud-native tools and ways of working. There's a single pane of glass to monitor, consistent security and governance policies. That wasn't the case before. Deployment flexibility to support, remote and edge use cases, where we're primarily going to focus in this presentation. And you can access and easy deploy additional services on premises for your private cloud instantiation. So your complexity really goes way down. As you move from left to right, this was meant to, each step forward was meant to cure the ails of the previous step. But it's interesting that right in the middle, the complexity really went up right before it got better. Okay. This one is a bit of an eye chart, but I'll try to work my way through it because it really illustrates how you move through a distributed cloud off the edge and all the data ingestion points. So you really start with right here at this ingestion point, right? You take it into the software, so you have all these little data lakes of all these data points that come in. You flow it right in, you do your analytics, right, which Kyndryl can help with that as well. You run analytics, you store the data, and then you feed it off to the line of business, okay? Or you take in that data and you flow it straight to a secondary location and you seed it there. Why would you do that? You may not need to take action right away, but this entire ecosystem is where we can deliver data capital from the edge. I used to be at Oracle, and we used to talk a lot about data capital. And IDC has an estimate that there's approximately $430 billion of economic advantage to larger organizations that analyze all data and deliver actionable insights. This entire ecosystem allows you to do that. And all throughout Kyndryl's organization, we can help you from either the network and the edge, the digital workplace on how you engage with it, setting up a private cloud instantiation that allows you to bring this data in and work with it, drive over to the public cloud side for this long-standing data, et cetera, and then all that pipeline, all that data is coming through all these little sections, right? We can capture IoT data from service machinery that might be critical to revenue. We can do it at a point of sale location where we're identifying what our customer patterns are. We can do it at 5G towers, the new instantiation of all the 5G towers that are going in, medical environments, energy sectors. We can do security and monitoring for health temps inside of manufacturing environments. All of these components are feeding data in. This is that 80 zettabytes of data that we were just talking about early, right? So what is it that we're offering? So from a Kyndryl perspective, we've got two offerings right now for a distributed cloud. We've got a remote office and edge deployment that's a small solution, 1 to 3 nodes, using Dell Microsoft certified hardware and Azure Arc services. And then we've got a more scalable solution that's a regional office or data center environment where we go from 4 to 16 nodes, Dell Microsoft certified hardware again, and Azure Arc services. So we can scale it out or we can do very, very small deployments, right? And the customer value here is deep integration with Arc, granular control over the infrastructure, reduced operational costs, a cloud-like business billing model, et cetera, and then certainly flexible deployments depending on how the structure of the business is actually set up. So let's make it a little bit real. So a lot of these verticals align with what I showed in terms of the edge ingestion points. But these are the verticals that we've seen so far with a very, very high propensity of use, okay? Telco, manufacturing, retail, and I'll give 3 industry use cases to support that: healthcare, energy, financial services. That's at the remote or the edge. Or from an infrastructure modernization perspective, you can modernize your legacy on-premises infrastructures, build a more performant hybrid cloud instantiation for the organization, or modernize the existing edge infrastructure. As I said earlier, we're on our 2nd, 3rd generation of edge infrastructure deployment. Now we need to connect it together and take advantage of all the data that's going to flow through there over time, right? I almost made the mistake early in the presentation of actually leaving who the telco name was because we're so close to being able to make it public. But we have a large Euro telco that is running two use cases. There's an external use case and an internal use case. Internal use cases, they're gathering IoT data for predictive maintenance on their towers that they're putting out in place, right? They're serving augmented reality software to facilitate real-time maintenance and repair. So they're sending folks out into the field when there is a tower, putting on the goggles and saying, listen, this is the problem that you're facing. This is what you need to go fix. And they're monitoring drone traffic that has lasers on it where they're shooting birds off the towers. You guys don't actually believe that part, do you? Okay, thank God. Kidding. So they're monitoring drone traffic to prevent damage to this 5G infrastructure, which is a rather large investment in the infrastructure that's out there, right? And then the external use case is they're going to package this up and resell this to their own clientele on the back end. So if you think hard enough about it, you'll be able to figure out who this telco is. So then manufacturing use cases. When used in maintenance and repair, so RMR, you can build a more connected factory, you can serve augmented reality software, you can run video systems for hazard, and then you can also modernize the infrastructure that's inside of those factories, right? So we've got remote and modernization use cases across both, right? And we have a lot of engagement with some manufacturers right now. Again, names that you would understand and know. Retail use cases, same thing. There's a data point out there, a quant out there that says 40% of shoppers out in the marketplace today would actually pay more for a better experience, right? So we're seeing, innovation that's around a connected store where they can capture the data from a point of sale system, do self-checkout, smart asset tracking, et cetera. All of this is feeding data back into the system. Or run security monitoring and hardware to prevent, loss that's a real problem in this environment. And they want to create a pipeline from the edge to the data warehouse, perform analytics, and make decisions real time on what they're going to do in the business, right? So those are just a few of those examples. And with that, we'll get to the meat of this, and I'll hand this over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
Thank you. So let's delve into a little bit more depth around what some of the building blocks are from a Microsoft, Dell, and Kyndryl perspective that really bring this to life. And from a Microsoft standpoint, Microsoft's strategy, and has been in place for a number of years now and continues to be the case going forward, is around Azure and the Azure platform meeting you where you are. It's not necessarily about just moving every workload to a public cloud. Maybe 5 years ago, that was the message. But now, it's about meeting you where you are. Bring the Azure platform and all of its benefits, all of its capabilities, all of its management control, security, and a whole host of services to where they're needed. In this case, at the edge. And so from a Microsoft perspective, the way they are bringing to market that ability is through something called Azure Arc. If you're not familiar with Azure Arc, at a high level, Azure Arc is a control plane. It's a control plane, a management plane that enables me to manage non-Azure-based resources, so things that live at the edge, things that live in another cloud or another hyperscaler, or at a colo or in your core data center, manage those from Azure and start to realize some of the Azure benefits for those workloads, even though they live on your footprint in your environment. And so that control plane element is the big key part of Azure Arc. But in addition to Azure Arc, Microsoft is enabling organizations through the power of Arc to push down services that historically have only ever been available in Microsoft data centers, now unlocking that and pushing them down to run at the edge as well. So not only can you benefit from Azure's management capabilities for your non-Azure based resources, but you can also benefit from actual Azure services running in your target locations. So think about some of the examples Levi talked about before around retail or manufacturing, where perhaps their development teams are building at scale in public Azure, but they need to run those applications once they've finished their development at the edge, close to the sources of data, close to where the manufacturing machinery may be, for example. Now, in order to run some of these services, we need to start to help modernize the data center, and that's where Azure Stack in particular Azure Stack HCI comes along from Microsoft. Now, if you're not familiar with Azure Stack HCI, it is the best way to start to bring Azure services down to run at the edge. And the examples that Levi gave in terms of those different manufacturing, retail, and other examples, telco included, are starting to do this. They're embracing this new subscription-based operating system. So just like in Azure, if you deploy a virtual machine or you deploy a database server or a Kubernetes cluster, it's pay-as-you-go, it's subscription-based. Azure Stack HCI, as an operating system, is subscription-based. It just happens to be running on hardware in your data center. It's connected with Azure, and the management from that point forward is driven by Azure. It brings the best of the virtualization layer from Azure, the software-defined storage, the software-defined networking, the integration from a disaster recovery perspective. It brings all of that Azure goodness on premises and opens the door to a much more modern cloud-native experience going forward. But it's not so alien that it's difficult to adopt for traditional enterprises. Many of our enterprise organizations we work with have huge investments and skills around managing Windows, managing Linux, managing servers, managing storage. Azure Stack HCI respects all of those investments and helps them modernize going forward and continues to integrate with existing tooling as well. And all of this runs great on the Dell integrated system for Azure Stack HCI, which is leading the way in terms of driving that integration between software and hardware. In particular, when it comes to the on-prem infrastructure, we want to make sure, from a Dell perspective and from a Microsoft perspective, that this is as cloud-like as possible. When you deploy a workload into Azure or any hyperscale cloud, the last thing you're thinking about is, I wonder how difficult it is for Microsoft to patch that physical server or for AWS to maintain that physical infrastructure, because it's all taken care of for you. And from an Azure Stack HCI perspective, the Dell tooling that we provide aims to provide that same level of autonomy, that same level of rich experience, empowering your admins to not focus vast amounts of time on managing and maintaining the physical infrastructure and just focus on bringing those Azure services down and provide the best platform for running applications and workloads. And so with Dell, enhancements to the platform include things like full lifecycle management to ensure patches, software, operating systems, and hardware, all in unison, ensuring they're up to date and maintained. Azure Stack HCI, as I said, is a subscription-based solution. So every year, Microsoft is releasing new capabilities into the platform. And the only way to adopt those is to maintain and update your systems. These aren't stagnant systems that sit in a corner for years and nobody ever touches them. These are cloud services. These are cloud systems. So they need to be maintained. And we want to make sure that's as easy as possible. Not just from a maintenance and an ongoing management perspective, but also for things like compliance. Dell has gone the extra mile with its Azure Stack HCI systems to ensure that it integrates with investments in Azure like Azure Policy. If anyone's used Azure Policy, it's a way of ensuring governance and compliance for Azure-based workloads. If you're now running Azure integrated systems on premises, then you want to know that they're compliant and meeting your regulatory needs as well. And that's where integration with technologies like Azure Policy and Azure really come to bear. But let's delve into Azure Arc a little bit more, because it's so critical to the overall hybrid story from Microsoft and Dell. When we think about that control plane, that's great that we can enable organizations who've got resources and investments on premises to bring them into the Azure footprint. But what does that mean? Well, in your scenarios, think about your environments on premises today at the edge, in the core data center, or even investments you've made in other hyperscale clouds like AWS or GCP. You've got those investments, those workloads, those services, and that's great. But managing them all from one place is tricky. With Azure Arc, I'm able to project, I don't need to move, I'm able to project those workloads at the edge, in the core data center, in alternative clouds, project those resources into Azure through the Arc-enabled infrastructure and manage them as if they were native Azure resources, from a common identity, a common governance, a common monitoring, a common security perspective. So even though those resources don't live in Azure, they're now part of the overall Azure experience. And that enables your infrastructure admins to centralize their processes, your developers to start to centralize their processes, and it really makes things a lot more efficient. But once you've got this Arc-enabled infrastructure, and this could be physical servers, virtual machines, Kubernetes clusters, a whole host of different physical resources and virtual resources that can be projected in. Once you've got resources projected into Azure, you can then start to push services out of Azure with Azure Arc-enabled services. So if you've ever used the public cloud and you've wanted let's say, for example, a new web app, you don't typically go to the trouble of deploying a big virtual machine and then installing web server components and then deploying the app. You go straight to the PaaS services because that's what's most efficient for the developers. And with Arc-enabled services, Microsoft is enabling organizations to use those same PaaS services that exist in public Azure, but now run them at the edge. So think back to my scenario before I talked about with the manufacturer or a retailer who's got a development team building apps in the Azure PaaS services, building apps at scale, global reach, and once that development's finished and their pipelines have run and their development processes have completed, they can deploy that same application without modification to the Azure Arc-enabled services now running on premises. So that's real agility, real efficiency for those development teams. And when we look at that in more of a blueprint or a block diagram, if you will, at the base here, we've got our Azure Stack HCI infrastructure, which is a great solution for traditional virtual machine workloads, Windows, Linux-based workloads. Azure today supports a whole host of different operating systems workloads across Linux and Windows. And from an Azure Arc perspective, once we integrate this Azure Stack HCI infrastructure running on Dell into Azure, we benefit from the whole management constructs, the governance, the security, the monitoring, the management, and more. And that's great for traditional virtual machine workloads, but we're all about pushing things forward, modernizing, and virtual machines isn't always the way to do that. We want to make sure that we've got different options as to how we can help modernize. Many organizations turn to Kubernetes for that, as that first step to modernize applications and workloads and deliver them in a different, more dynamic way. But Kubernetes isn't without its challenges. It's complex, it's tricky. It requires new skills for traditional enterprises. And many of those enterprises turn to the public cloud for Kubernetes because, well, a lot of that abstraction and that management complexity of deploying Kubernetes is taken care of for us by the hyperscaler. Well, in Microsoft's case, with AKS, the Azure Kubernetes Service, they've packaged that solution in such a way that it can now be pushed down and deployed on premises on top of Azure Stack HCI. So you now are building this small-scale or large-scale solution that consists of powerful on-prem physical infrastructure, running this modern software-based solution for virtualizing both traditional workloads and now an option for running Kubernetes-based workloads as well. And again, all managed and integrated with Azure for deployment of applications, monitoring, security, management, governance, and more. And once you have that Kubernetes layer in place, you can then start to push down some of those Arc-enabled services, packaged services that previously have only ever been available in the Microsoft data center. Now we can take those and we can push them out to the edge where we need them to run in close proximity to our other applications and services. So whether it's machine learning, data services like SQL Server managed instance, Postgres hyperscale, or whether it's application services like web apps, serverless computing, logic apps. These are all examples of Arc-enabled services that Microsoft has decoupled from being locked in the Microsoft data centers and now enables you to run at your disposal in the different locations, whether it's a retail store, a manufacturing site, a telco location. These are some of the big benefits that Microsoft is unlocking through Azure Arc. And the reality is it's all paid for through consumption. So the more or the less you use, the more or less you pay. Because these are all cloud services, so all OpEx based. So these are some of the technologies that are really enabling organizations to pick and choose these as-a-service components to meet their needs in those different respective locations. So definitely my advice to you is definitely take a look at Azure Arc. If you've already got an investment in a VMware infrastructure for today, great. Azure Arc can integrate with VMware vSphere. If you've already invested in an existing CNCF certified Kubernetes distro, Great, because the Azure Arc-enabled Kubernetes integration can manage that as well, deploy applications, start to introduce the security and monitoring capabilities. And these additional services can run on any CNCF certified Kubernetes platform. So although this is a very Microsoft-centric view, and it's a great platform, there's alternatives if you've got those existing investments, and Azure Arc is the key to enabling that. So with that, I'll hand back to the close.
Okay. Oh, sorry about that. We did get a little shock there. It's because I was in electric preso. Q&A. Any thoughts, questions, concerns? You want to throw tomatoes?
Well, I mean, you have, obviously you're talking about Azure and Arc, etc., but Amazon has a similar thing with AWS, Outpost, etc.
Yep.
It's a similar concept.
In some ways, yeah.
Yeah, and then you've got IBM with IBM Cloud Satellite, essentially doing similar things. So what's the differentiation?
You're asking me or Matt? Okay.
Yeah, I can take a shot at that. So AWS are doing similar things, yeah, that's right. But with Outposts, that requires that significant deployment and investment in that AWS specific element. Whereas Azure Arc is more about saying, okay, you've got an existing investment in vSphere, for example. You've got an existing investment in Tanzu on vSphere for Kubernetes or OpenShift on vSphere for Kubernetes. Let's help you push down these additional Arc-enabled services to what you've got without needing you to go to Azure Stack HCI or another solution. So there's more, I think, of the element of meeting you where you are and centralizing into the Azure control plane. And that's true also of other cloud-based offerings. So for example, even if an organization had invested heavily in EKS in native Azure, in native AWS, and they've made a heavy departmental investment in deploying Kubernetes apps on Amazon. But strategically, that customer had chosen a path for the rest of their infrastructure on Azure. Azure Arc can help tie that Kubernetes investment that doesn't have to move, it can stay where it is on AWS, it can tie it back into that strategic direction that customer's taking in Azure. So Azure can still become the control plane and help with future investments in other areas, but Kubernetes could still be AWS-centric. That's where Azure Arc, I think, is different. AWS, GCP aren't making those strides to help be the multi-cloud manager, if you will. So different approaches, pros and cons for both, but I think there's some of the key differentiations for where Microsoft are going in this space.
So, yeah. So from Kyndryl's perspective, we offer all of that, plus Oracle, plus Alibaba, all under the distributed cloud umbrella. So to his point, we've focused heavily from the distributed cloud group on Microsoft initially, but on our roadmaps, we show a relationship between distributed cloud offerings from Oracle. Historically, given that we spun out from IBM, we have IBM Satellite in our bag of tools as well. With the Amazon offering, the Outpost offering, there's not a lot that we, in my area, have a lot to do with that. We can manage it. We can help manage it from a client perspective. But from where I sit inside of distributed cloud across the rest of the portfolio of the offerings I talked about, we can advise, build, deploy, manage, all of those for the client, and a blend of all of those. So if there is the existing implementation of any or all of those, we can help structure support around all of that. So we don't just isolate to one area of distributed cloud. We actually offer a smorgasbord of distributed cloud offerings there. And again, we do have that legacy with IBM Satellite as well. Have we stair-stepped prioritization on the roadmap of where we will focus? Yeah, it was easy for us to bring the IBM in there. Then we made a conscious decision to look at Microsoft and Dell being market leaders there. And then we looked at Google and AWS. Consciously chose to bump Oracle in front of that because of the relationship now that's been stated between Microsoft and Oracle and the superhighway that Larry announced at Oracle Cloud World between the two clouds and their distributed cloud portfolio. So we have an offering around cloud at customer, as well as the Exadata offerings. Yes, sir.
Distributed cloud, it's a pretty complex undertaking. So the scheduling, did you folks build your own scheduler, workload scheduler, across all of these heterogeneous cloud, Kubernetes cloud, Microsoft HCI?
That all comes underneath.
Let me just give
Sorry, go ahead.
So in Kubernetes, they have their own scheduler to schedule containers. So in your distributed cloud, I have Kubernetes, I have HCI, I have whatever, some other OpenStack. So don't you need some kind of a higher level abstraction, scheduling abstraction that looks at all of these, or is that pretty much
So are you thinking?
one customer goes to only one cloud? So you don't straddle across clouds? What?
I'm trying to think of the best way to answer this. So Azure Arc would straddle across clouds in terms of management, governance, control, security. But whether it would give you the scheduling specifics that you're referring to, potentially not. That maybe require a more specialized solution. But in terms of autonomy for deploying different types of workloads to the different types of platforms that Arc understands, it could certainly help automate a lot of that. So for example, if you had Kubernetes clusters running in GCP, AWS, Tanzu on vSphere, Physical Rancher, and AKS on HCI, and you had all of those projected into Azure Arc, you benefit there from the centralized view of the ability to apply centralized application deployment, monitoring, security, and so on. Does it give you the deep scheduling and intelligence across all of those different clusters to do? Potentially, but I don't think that's something that's baked in today. Bring in the virtual machine side and some of the other server management capabilities that Arc gives you, and it becomes that more centralized management solution, but it may not have all of the individual tick boxes that you're looking for there.
So essentially, if I'm deploying an application and I want 10 replicas of that application, so all of those replicas will go to one cluster.
They could, but that also depends on how your build pipelines and deployment pipelines are distributing that application. So if you had in your endpoints of your CI/CD pipeline 10 different clusters, then you could round robin through and distribute across your 10 different clusters, all from a centralized pipeline. But if you point at one cluster, then naturally it's just going to get distributed within the workers of that single cluster.
Other questions, thoughts? Yes, sir.
So I imagine your customers will deploy any sort of application on these nodes that you're managing. How do you deal with like their restrictions around like when you can update the software, when you're allowed to restart the node? Like,
So you're talking about a management control over how the data is moving, right?
we're like setting up maintenance windows so that you don't kick your customer's application off at some crucial time. Like, how do you manage that?
So that's really an Azure Arc management question, Matt.
Yeah, and so the question was how you manage and schedule maintenance at a high level across the environments without impacting customer workloads and applications. And so there's multiple layers at play here. So for example, if you were Azure Arc managing a set of virtual infrastructure with traditional virtual machines, all of the update management of that underlying infrastructure can be scheduled and planned for maintenance windows, but also the impact to workload should be none because of technologies like live migration, vMotion, etc., that will help to maintain the physical layer without impacting the virtual layer. Traditional virtual machines, Windows and Linux guests may or may not need patching and rebooting depending on their own requirements, so that's a separate consideration. But when you talk about Kubernetes clusters specifically and apps in there, that's where the Kubernetes update management capabilities within Kubernetes would assist, and Arc can help drive that. There's a lot of update management capabilities built into Azure as an optional service that can be wrapped around this Arc managed infrastructure that could also help maintain operating systems, applications, and workloads. When you start to get to the higher level PaaS services that are within the Arc-enabled portfolio, just like in Azure, Microsoft takes care of those patches at the back end, and your applications, you don't notice, you don't feel that impact, depending on how you've architected and deployed the application. and the number of instances you've deployed. So there's our application architecture decisions that need to be made for the app, as well as those planning, those maintenance. But all of the tools and frameworks are there to enable that for you.
Final thoughts as we land this plane? Okay. In that instance, thank you for your time. Appreciate it. Enjoy the
Thanks,
rest of the
folks.
show.
Thank you.